Our next speaker of the day has earned her master trainer, master instructor title while employed with the Department of Defense. Armed with a biomechanical engineer accreditation, she was responsible for designing specialized programs and the supervision of complete success regarding force readiness, unique mission responsibilities, and elite force protection. This was achieved by understanding the goals and requirements placed on physical and mental strength assignments that are demanded and expected for today's active duty members and civilian anti-terrorist units. This is like high-level stuff, folks. Very, very good government training. This includes assignment with Homeland Security, private sector security forces. She is schooled and certified as a private investigator. She consistently demonstrates knowledge, technical requirements, legal parameters, and commitment to evidence-based investigation using the latest technologies and methodologies deployed by professional law enforcement officers in a modern and forward-moving scientific environment. This will explain her next position and why it is so cool to have her in this position. She joined MUFON in 1996, was selected as the STAR team manager and the deputy director of investigations through 2011. She was responsible for the program design, protocols, and investigation procedures for a national rapid response unit. This position included supervision of the most experienced investigators and access to the most sensitive and complex cases reported to MUFON. And in civilian UFO research, that kind of thing never existed before then. Rapid response depended on whether your field investigator in that county would get their butt out of bed and go out there and investigate the case. And it could be days or weeks. So this kind of protocol, gearing more toward the kind of rapid response that the government would have in a situation like this, very helpful for us getting data in real time. So that's fantastic to have somebody with her training in that position. She leads the special assignment team of experienced and specialized investigators in MUFON responsible to the reports that need specific and thorough attention. As an international CAG investigator, she focuses her attention on national UFO cases reported in Mexico, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Central America. I would imagine she's been very busy. In November 2016, she became a registered and official lobbyist for the UFO field. I think this might be the first also. This goal was realized through a progressive understanding that to truly influence change and offer knowledgeable commentary on the realities of the UFO phenomenon, you must include our nation's elected and the very people that are trusted as our lawmakers. Her efforts will focus on document declassification and an ombudsman. That is not nice putting that in here. It's a hard word to say. Ombudsman role for witnesses and those most affected by unknown technologies. This is done through the Field Reports, a science and technology investigation group. She continues to be an active investigator, responding to reports and international cases. She has an extensive history in the field of ufology and a diverse investigation background that includes MUFON field reports to ancient artifacts, as demonstrated by her study and hands-on forensic contributions to the elongated skull phenomenon, the Star Child skull, in which she maintains the lead investigation. The evidence available in UFO events remains the focus as she keeps the standard high and the ethical aptitude in all that she does. And this is also very important. Investigators can get sloppy, and you don't want that. There is no compromise when the truth is at stake. That is what she says. She is author of 2 popular books, Admissible, The Field Investigator's Manual with Richard Dolan, and the first of its kind children's book, Are Aliens Really Real? Both can be found on Amazon. In her most recent TV appearances with Rob Lowe, Chase lends her expert. Did you guys know that Rob Lowe's really into UFOs, the actor? Okay. Chase leads her expertise to the investigation of the alleged Malibu underwater alien base. The episode can be found on A&E On Demand. Chase has been featured with Josh Gates on Expedition Unknown and the Travel Channel. She and Josh investigated a break-in case for MUFON at the Board Camp Crystal Mine in Mena, Arkansas. The video evidence that was captured has made headlines. Her presentation today is in 2013, as a team of researchers investigators began the first forensic collection of DNA on a pre-selected group of Peruvian elongated skulls. For the first time in history, the investigation standards met the highest levels of federal and international directives by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the National Institute of Justice. And I can tell you that it wasn't that many years ago. It was very, very hard to get a lab to analyze anything if you said it was related to aliens. These scientists did not want to put themselves on the line. So this is amazing work to be able to do this kind of investigation at this level. So, join me in welcoming Chase Kloetzke.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you so much. Thank you. I am so excited to be here. It's Arkansas. It is the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference, and I'm telling you, it rocks. It really does. Yes, it does. Since I've been here last, there's been a few changes, and some things have not changed. As he mentioned in the intro, I did become an official registered card-carrying ID on my badge lobbyist for the UFO field, which came in handy since soon after I had done this, and unexpectedly, my husband tells me we're moving to DC. So that's the other thing that has changed, is moving from Southeast Georgia, beautiful temperatures right there on the shores, eastern shores of the Atlantic, to about 2.5 blocks, 3 blocks from the Capitol. And we now have 695 square feet, and it's all ours. Another thing that has changed recently is that I have just accepted in MUFON a position called the Director of Investigations, and kind of hoping, beyond hope, that we can really rally MUFON investigators and continue doing the outstanding work of this organization, which has literally become the archivists and historians of the UFO field. Basically, some things haven't changed. So some of the things that haven't, one very important one, is that I am still involved with skulls. It happened randomly. I don't know how I got involved in this, but I'm still very, very actively involved. The elongated skulls of Peru are remarkable. They're interesting because, obviously, of their shape, but these are ancient, and they usually come in mummy form. So how this UFO investigator ended up in the back of a museum, invited by the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, unwrapping 1,000-year-old mummies, and then sampling DNA. I'd say it was a long story, but these are some of the incredible things that can happen when we become investigators, but we follow a scientific method. With that said, our field tends to be esoteric, and there are things that we can't prove. But I think when we approach every investigation, even in those that should be ridiculous, but are told by some of the most credible people on this earth, even the approach with the scientific process is possible for every single witness out there. So this is why I've really tried to hone in my skills. I believe that we're not really trying to convince anyone, but our job as an investigator is to settle a case or to come up with a disposition if possible. So the best way to do this is to follow probably things that are proven already, is the best way to put it. And that would be, if the wheel's not broken, we don't have to fix it. So I currently and really insist on following the same type of investigation protocols, whether we're investigating a murder, a robbery, a car accident for an insurance company, UFOs, or an alleged abduction. The process is all the same if we're going to be admissible and to be able to hand our witnesses probative and definitive reports in the end. This also comes with sometimes being invited to join a team of biblical researchers. The team with the Elongated Skulls comes from a team from the biblical prophecy community. They're looking for a hybrid race, and I'm looking for the hybrid race, whether this is ancient or in modernity. I've been pursuing this for quite a few years, 5 years in the ancient artifacts, and most recently, about a year ago, really looking for the relevant proof of the hybrid race today on this earth. So if it exists, I want to know about it, and I would like some DNA. And this isn't so much to prove. What we found with involving ourselves in DNA is that there's so much more to learn than just, yes, we have this origin. There's so much more, and that's going to be part of the reveal I have today, because we have brand new evidence. What you're not going to get from me are statements, proclamations, or headlines that read, DNA proves Nephilim. You know, we found the alien DNA. These things are not possible because we don't have a comparison. But what we are finding is by contributing a lot of this new information into the genetic genome and the bank, we are significantly advancing our chances of finding this and finding it soon, especially with the advances going on today. So this elongated skull phenomena really started way before us. Of course, it was 1927, and there was an archaeologist named Julio C. Tilo, and he was an amazing and very noted archaeologist because he was the first one to use a scientific method in any of his excavations and also in his processing of any artifacts or remains found in his work. He actually was in a market in Peru, and he purchased this extraordinary ancient textile. And this textile was so ornate, so perfect, so decorative. It really was unmatched in anywhere that he's ever seen in South America. And it started him on a trek. This piece was bought in Pisco, South America, not far from Peru at all. And he followed the trail, which led him to Paracas. He was the first to ever use a scientific method on an archaeology excavation, and his work remains the most significant and accurate source of information regarding the Paracas culture. And this is Tilo here. And he had first discovered 429 mummies, and they're unique in the burials in Peru because they buried them in bundles. But this is Tilo. He's still very revered in the Ministry of Culture in South America. This is probably one of the richest finds because of the artwork and craftsmanship in not only the textiles, but the pottery and cultural artifacts that were not only advanced, but progressive for this time. He found this in a necropolis, which is very close to the necropolis that we were finding ours as well. Thank you. These are the bundles. Actually, you're going to see both of these in just a moment, but this is what they look like when we first get our hands on them. And of course, this is what the bundles look like before the extraction process begins. What the obvious differences were that Tilo, which really surprised him originally, were the obvious differences in the mummies, and he has documented and has had extensive study from the beginning. There are deviations and striking differences from normal human and indigenous biology, and has generated acute scrutiny and study for decades. Hypothesis of these newly found types of remains include hybrid beings of aliens, aliens themselves, hybrids, beings, gods, and of course, Nephilim, which is angel and human. Very, very interesting. And of course, one of the most distinct observations when we're first looking at these mummies is the red hair, which is not indigenous to the Peruvian population. This is the necropolis where he originally had his find, and this is also the necropolis in Chongos, and this is where we are finding a lot of our work that we've been invested today. As we see in this comparison slide, how the shape of the head is much different than just a normal skull. We have a lot of the elongated skulls. There are literally thousands of them. So when you first go to the museums and you see them behind the glass, you realize there's hundreds of them. We hear of hundreds of them. But you walk into the back rooms of the museums, and they are ceiling to floor, shelves to shelves, and room after room after room of nothing but elongated skulls. So what we know is that the practice of cradle boarding and manual manipulation was absolutely part of this culture. And when I say part of a culture, experts do not know exactly where the Paracas people came from or exactly what happened to them. So this adds to a mystery for people like me that love it and live for every mystery that somehow crosses my laptop. You know, I'm kind of that person that will go online for a recipe, and 5 hours later, 9/11 was definitely an inside job. Here's a typical elongated skull, and then this one's a bit different. It's unique because the shape of it, first of all, it's much bigger. And my favorite part of the comparisons, you have to have this when it all comes down to part of that scientific process. The differences that we're seeing in these elongated skulls, the first question we're asking ourselves is, well, are some of these anomalies really due to the type of binding? Because we know there are many types of ways that we can create elongated skulls. Is it the size of the individual? What about the diet? Does that affect some of the abnormalities that we're finding in some of these skulls? And basically, we learned there was a lot of unpacking to do in this mystery. This is a slide I like to show basically because all over Peru and Bolivia, and we also investigate the Bolivian elongated skulls. But all along there's these little villages and there's these little towns, and there could be just this little mom and pop store. It almost looks like a little shed off of a home, and they'll have a sign out in front that they have some soda and water for sale, and you walk in and on display, they just have remains. And these elongated skulls, and some of the most unusual skulls are found in the private collections. The other interesting part in Peru are the amount of privately owned museums that are almost in competition with the museums that are run by the Ministry of Culture. So this is not as unique as you would think it would be to, just be doing a little shopping, stopping on your way, getting a little drink or something, and walk in and see something as extraordinary as this. The further out that you go from mainstream, like Lima, or where the culture is made into tourism and a little more advanced in some of the villages, the explanations of these elongated skulls seem to take a mainstream line. The further you go out, you can walk into just a little area and say, what is this? And they'll tell you, it's alien, it's a hybrid, it's part of our past, they were here first. So it's interesting to hear all these different cultural explanations, and yet they all seem to be the further away from the mainstream line that they're supposed to tell you. The story goes more towards an oral tradition. Very, very interesting. We have many, many tough and thorough examinations. And basically, we were able to start figuring out an inventory of the differences of the skulls. Because if this was a practice in Peru, obviously most of these skulls are going to be manually manipulated. But are there some that were not? What makes a culture or a race of people or a society that was intelligent enough to build something like Machu Picchu? Wake up on a Monday and say, oh my gosh, we should be cone heads, wanna? You know, you wonder why this elongated shape, that this was something to be desired, because one of the other things we've learned is that only the royals could do this, or the free. Slaves were not allowed to elongate their skulls, and that's why we still find very normal human heads and mummies in Peru. And then we have the elongated skulls that are clearly manipulated. And then there's a small percentage that are just different from everything else. So was this emulation, or is it possible to find evidence of the remains of something else? Here's another one. This little guy is quite popular, but all over, full mummies. I just find them amazing. We also see cradle deformation and head boarding in modernity, and this is what some of them look like. There's different styles of doing this. This is a more modern way to elongate a skull, but I had to put this picture up because you could clearly see some of the remains and markings where banding occurred. Also notice the way the foramen magnum would be, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But you're clearly seeing some signs that when we look at this, we can also start developing that kind of clearinghouse of physical attributes that we can start separating, okay, this skull is truly different because it's not showing all the clear signs of manual manipulation. So this one goes here, and probably 300 are on this side. And that really was it. We found one possible skull to test out of about 300 to 350 skulls we found. These are the two bundles that we saw earlier. This is an adult, and this is a little baby. And it was quite an honor. They were both found in the Chongos necropolis, which is right outside of Paracas. And it was such a great honor because when we got down there, we begged these guys, do not unwrap this mummy. One of the things that we have that's one of our biggest challenges or one of our biggest hurdles is obviously contamination. Everybody touches the skulls. Everybody gets to touch these skulls. So the more we could find it in this state, the better our odds of collecting DNA that had absolutely no contamination. So there was 3 of us in the room. We had this little bundle, this little tiny baby, and we start unwrapping it, and there's a moment where you realize that this was a being here on Earth. So all the care when we are touching the skulls, working with the skulls and taking samples, we really, really have a reverence. We're respecting the fact that these are, remains. These, you treat them like your grandmother or, any other human on this earth because they're just so special. So with this in mind, we started unwrapping one layer at a time on this little baby. The closer to the head we got, the more clear the textiles were and the designs on this little guy. And as a mom and a grandmother, I realized immediately that this is what a mom or a family would do if they had lost a child. They would absolutely do everything they possibly could and only put the best around his little face. And we started seeing these little baby turtles on the border of all this material. Little baby turtles and fish. And I was so blown away by that because, that's what we put on our children today. Little babies have like little baby animals. And I was just blown away by this because he's ancient. He's ancient. And the textiles were amazing. This is what he looked like the minute we took off that last layer. I can tell you the audience went crazy. There was 3 of us in there, the big audience. But then LA and Brian Forrester, as soon as we had finished with this, got our samples and everything, then they were allowed to come into the room. And I'll explain why that is in a moment as well. But the first thing we notice is this baby has reddish blonde hair. And its little features were completely tiny. When we were first told about this, we were told that it was most likely a 2-month-old infant. So obviously, this was a significant find because the shape of his head cannot be done in 2 months. So he was born that way. Some of the elongated skulls also demonstrate such a cluster of anomalies that are really not associated with the other skulls. You're going to see a lot of this artist, and throughout my presentation, she is amazing. Her name is Marcia K. Moore, and she is a forensic reconstructionist. However, she's not completely certified, although she is completely trained. So she calls herself an interpreter, an impressionist, but artistic impressionist. But this is definitely the recreation using all the same techniques as FBI. And when you can see from this Chongo skull, you just put a little skin and muscle where it belongs, put some hair on it, and it's striking. Absolutely striking. The act of headboarding. Many of these practices also added to our research because now we're starting to create a verifiable list of known anomalies associated with elongated skulls and what are these. Both of these skulls that I pictured here earlier are also part of the DNA analysis that I'm going to be talking about today. The little toddler was found also demonstrating those anomalous characteristics and had a larger than normal cranial capacity. The reddish blonde hair and also the burial artifacts suggest definitely that he was a royal. This is another example of what basically skin, muscles produced in the right place according to a skull. Again, this is interpretive, but they're just amazing. It's one thing to see the skull, it's another to see what it would look like alive. And I think it brings a whole new perceptive. And again, the skull and what it would look like in 3D, how she got going. This skull here, we nicknamed her Cinnamon. The recreationist, Marcia, had done a wonderful job, and this is what she looks like. Except we recently found out she is not a she, she's a he. So that's another thing that DNA and proper testing will give us, is the truth of even the sex of these skulls, because looking at them, we have a tendency to just start saying she and he. So it's just very interesting. Again, this is the Chongo skull with that hair. I just find those fascinating. I'm trying not to rush through these so everyone can get a really good perspective. So this is kind of the past on where we are starting. At this point, we're seeing all this. We're down in Peru. We're completely fascinated. We were given unprecedented access by the invitation of the Ministry of Culture president in Lima on several of the museums to go into the back room and start working with the Peruvian archaeologists on what skulls presented the anomalies we were most looking for on that inventory list. And together we would pick the skulls that would be ready for analysis. But I want to play just a little video for you guys, because this will kind of help demonstrate where we started and where we're going.
Since 2010, I've been directing a series called Watchers with L.A. Marzulli. I knew that L.A. for many years had done an in-depth study on the theory about giants roaming the earth as stated in various ancient texts. As I was attempting to gain insight on this topic for the films we were producing, we both started amassing newspaper clippings going back to the late 1800s. The examples were numerous and revealed giants found in North America as well as the island of Catalina. There's also a preponderance of strange and unusual structures all over the world that no one seems to know who's responsible. Huge megalithic stones weighing hundreds of tons and meticulously put together. Who built them and why? Sometimes the stones were determined to have come from many miles away. With old Hebrew newspapers as well as fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls also citing the finding of giant bones underground and spooking the Arabs who found it and fled in terror, I also had the opportunity to visit Gilgal in Israel and got stuck in the mud in an area along the minefield border with Jordan, where ancient texts reveal the location of one of the largest giants in biblical times, the giant Og. If we could try and investigate these ancient texts as historical documents, then it made sense to do that. The mystery remained that strange and unusual findings were located in Peru. LA contacted Brian Forrester, a local expert and author who has put a lot of time and effort into studying this phenomena. So we visited the Lima Museum as well as the Ica Museum, where one of the largest skulls in existence is kept. But all these skulls were behind glass. And at the time, the museum in Lima was being remodeled. It wasn't until Brian decided to take us to Paracas and introduce us to Senor Juan Navarro and his private museum that we could examine any of these skulls up close. Seeing them this closely was really amazing. We began on this initial trip to gather information, sizes of the skulls, measured dimensions and cranial mass comparisons with normal skulls. This was the beginning of doing more conclusive testing, and DNA testing had to be done. We began to realize that some of these skulls were created via cranial deformation, while others seemingly weren't. It was the select few skulls that had none of the customary indentations of cradle headboarding that we were interested in. And it was my job to film and document these trips and our findings. Our search continued over the next few years with permission from Senor Juan to unwrap a baby mummy, one where we knew where the rest of the family had once been buried but had been dug up by the huaycaros, the grave robbers. In unwrapping it and getting a dental expert to examine its teeth for clues, it was determined that the baby was between 18 and 24 months old, not old enough for cranial head boarding to have had created such an enormous effect on its head. Gradually, our team got larger, with additional archaeological work by Aaron Judkins as well as Mondo Gonzalez. We also realized that we needed a forensic expert to take samples properly and brought in Chase Kloetzke, who scientifically tagged and bagged each piece removed in the correct lab containers. In a coincidental meeting, I met a man from Oregon who owned a huge skull from La Arroya, Peru. It had been in his family for decades, and we were allowed to take DNA samples of it. LA contacted 3 genetics labs that specialized in paleo DNA, who gave us instructions on how to take DNA samples the way they would. As our expertise improved, only the Lakehead Paleogenetics Lab in Canada would allow us to use their name in the films we were making, while the other 2 prestigious labs, both in California, preferred to stay anonymous. LA then met Rick Woodward, an archaeologist who also had studied skulls of this type and came to the conclusion that elongated skulls that were born this way seem to all exhibit a repositioning of the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain. This hole proved to be closer to the occipital area of the head and was smaller in diameter than on a regular human skull. The theory was that it provided more balance to support a head of this size. With permissions in the fall of 2016, we were allowed to take fresh DNA samples from a large number of skulls, both from the Ica Museum as well as the late Senior Juan's private museum, which had now been moved to a new location. All these skulls were sampled, photographed, and meticulously detailed by grinding to powder in recessed areas to get fresh DNA samples below the surface of the bone where it would have been contaminated over the years by handling. The powder was taken under the surface, tagged and bagged, and having gone through customs was sent to the labs. Early tests proved repeatedly that the haplogroup origin to the vast majority of these elongated heads, even though they were discovered in Peru, came from the Middle East. And some haplogroups indicated an origin in Europe, North Africa, and the Levant. But today, the remaining evidence from the last trip, where many more skulls were tested, will be revealed for the very first time. You will learn the lab results along with the rest of us, and the overwhelming number of skulls tested should help with this find that even if some of the skulls might have been contaminated, the finding should give us at least an average of what the prevalent haplogroup might suggest, that hopefully is where these beings came from. We'll find out together.
Several things come out in this video, such as once we had a forensic dentist come in and examine the infant we had just unwrapped, instead of the 2-month-old that was reported, we indeed had a toddler, more of a toddler size, of 18 to 22 months old. The reason the dentist came in is because the crowd went crazy. LA, everybody there was just freaking out. Everybody was so excited because this little baby presented the strawberry blonde hair, the shape of the skull, everything we were looking for. And so the theory was he was born this way. I sat there and I was very excited. My heart's pounding out of my chest. I'm so happy for LA, who is the lead of this team. And I was so happy for our team. And then I saw what every other mom in here would have seen, and my heart sunk because I had to pop LA's bubble because the little allegedly 2-month-old baby had a full set of teeth. So I knew he was a toddler, and it just broke my heart to have to say something to LA. And he's like, "Oh my God, well maybe he was born with this." And I'm like, "LA, this stop. We just need to have this professionals come in with that expertise. And so LA immediately brought in the dentist. However, at first we thought that 18 months to 22 might be old enough to cause that deep of an elongation. And over the years, we found out it was not long enough. So this is why the baby is still relevant and within this. One of the, getting ready to segue now into the investigation itself, how we took it, the whole process. But I did want to explain that we had 3 challenges that were enormous during our quest and our adventure and our expedition. And one of my biggest complaints and pet peeves, I just get so aggravated, is that independent researchers and investigators do not use a scientific method. Of course we do. And I get so aggravated when we have professionals or institutions pointing fingers that maybe our findings aren't as good as theirs because we're independent. We're not working under certain protocols or certain oversight type of work, which again is also untrue. As in any scientific investigation, we are going to start out basically the same way as everyone else. But it is basically a procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurements, experiment, the formulation, testing, and modification of your hypotheses. First you ask the question, then you're going to research, then you're going to formulate your hypothesis or theory. Next, we test this question. We do this with noted experts and accredited labs and technicians and the industry professionals and using only their protocols. And then next, we're going to test this question and we're going to repeat it and we're going to go through a couple of these tests, including blind studies, to ensure our results. We will then analyze these results in a collaborative effort with the scientists and experts, and the final stage is reporting our results, which is exactly what I'm doing today. So I have a real pet peeve when people think that just because we're independent, we are not following standards, and of course we are. The hypothesis that we were working under as a team is a little different. Remember, this is a biblical prophecy team. We were completely funded through that kind of arena of interest. I am the heathen of the group. I am the UFO investigator that was brought in because of the forensic credentials and expertise that I've been working on pretty much my whole career. But so when we read the hypothesis, mine was a little different. But because this was funded, and you never know, I'm going to go ahead and read this one. But we had an ancient and historical reference to consider. And this also had to enter the investigation. The hypothesis had matured from just giants, or the hybrid race known as Nephilim. This was based on biblical narrative. But we have to also include a hybrid race of extraterrestrial design. But the hypothesis that was noted and quoted is this possible connection and evidence of Anakim? And of course, Anakim is one of the tribes mentioned in the Torah, and it translates as long necks. This was a race of giants, descendants of Arba, dwelling in southern part of Canaan, particularly in Hebron, actually. They had a very warlike appearance, and this struck the Israelites with terror, and this was during the time of Moses. They were disposed by Joshua. As the study and observations mount, there are biomechanical engineering discrepancies that would indicate a divergence from completely human race and a completely human genetic code. So this was the hypothesis that we presented to the Ministry of Culture and part of the white paper and scientific study. We also used the Torah as a historical or literal document versus other things it's been referred to. And as a ufologist, I was very interested in any divergent DNA, as you can imagine. We selected the skulls. Once again, the inventory of some of the things that we would find that were different than the skulls that we could absolutely see were manipulated manually. And this is the things that we started calculating. We were looking for the skulls that had no sagittal sutures visible, larger cranial capacity. The reason this was important is cradle boarding does not increase the internal capacity. Your brain and everything stays the same size. It stays the same. You're just shaping it differently. But in some of these skulls, they were presenting greater. They were much larger. And we know that this shouldn't be going on. Unusually larger dolichocephalic cranium. I love this word, dolichocephalic. It just means cone head. You know, like when you become a doctor, you know, half of the reasons they go to school so long is just to learn the new technology because they're going to call the kneecap something else. But I love that. We're also looking for an abnormal foramen magnum placement nearer to the occipital plate, and we're looking for no visible signs of obvious cranial deformation. Our comparison craniometric analysis of the foramen magnum concluded this would be a human, a pretty normal. And then you see on the skulls that we've selected how much they are closer to this occipital area and how different they look. They look completely different. And we were also missing these little ovales that are absolutely missing. And these were some of the more advanced things we were finding at this time. And of course, we know that, you know, bones obliterate, you know, so sometimes they'll just come together. It's why we can heal bones. And there's sometimes very little signs of that break or where they've come together. They will fuse. So we have these answers, but what we're looking for are the skulls that present all of them. Not just, oh, this one's, you know, it's the foramen magnum's a little closer to the occipital plate. They had to present all of the inventory to be tested. The suture lines of an adult, basically what that was showing was the normal sutures that are present on a human skull versus the ones that were missing. The sagittal sutures were definitely gone. So now that we've kind of gone through all the back data, our inventory, exactly what we were looking for and why, let's go through the process and exactly what happened. This, being an evidence collection, or what they call it really is called expert, guys. I'm not calling myself an expert, but basically it's a professional international title that I earned through extensive training class, time in the field, involved with evidence collection and handling that included courses with topic testing, evaluations, and finally, certification. In a nutshell, I've really gotten good at how to protect, document, preserve. I'm also a licensed, what they call evidence custodian for property and evidence. So my job on this team, 100%, was to protect, document, preserve. The main purpose of evidence collection is to retrieve all the evidence as is, without damaging or any kind of distortion to it. All samples must be handled correctly and packaged according to strict guidelines to minimize deterioration or contamination. The protocols that I follow personally are the National Institute of Justice and the National Institute of Science and Technology, and they are the guidelines and dictators or overseers of the protocols of all evidence collection through criminal justice system. This also includes the effort and steps taken for proper protections, identifications, marking, extractions, storage, and the chain of custody procedures and methods employed for this examination. When I first started talking about the challenges and getting started, I mentioned 3 of them. I talked about 1. And the second challenge facing this team were the international statutes and policies on forensic examinations, and of course, transporting human samples across the border. Not as easy as you think. Of course, nobody would think that would be easy. Permissions and authorizations for investigation and transport were not only important, but we had to have them granted by proper authorities through the Ministry of Culture and all museum curators. This also included proper packaging considerations and decisions to ensure samples would pass any scrutiny of border officials. Basically, we were answering to everyone, every single one. Yes. So basically, our samples had to be secure and fundamentally safe in any environment of travel, and we had to meet all international postage requirements. This led me to consider and choose only effective sample containment devices that would protect our evidence for proper analysis, but to also ensure all safety measurements of containment that would meet that postal code and biological materials. The approved extraction tools and packaging forensic supplies that were employed on all the examinations and collections were professional items, and they were all purchased through an accredited forensic supply store. And if you guys like to know, I only use Arrowhead Forensics, only because they're cheaper for excellent product. But the supplies met the highest levels of federal and state enforcement, professional standards, directives, again, the national standards, the National Institute for Science and Technology, and the National Institute of Justice protocols. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is our days of popsicle sticks, Ziploc bags, and sniffing dirt are over. All forensic decisions were chosen to effectively meet all the admissibility and professional standards we had to have. Proper and qualified supplies must be used to meet the critical and necessary burden of proof, but we also have to satisfy a very scientific scrutiny and the scrutiny that the public's going to give us. And we welcome the scrutiny. It's part of the process. We want everyone, including the scientific community, to study our work, study our process, and then recreate our results to check our testing. We have to invite this. So when you're kind of getting out there with that kind of challenge, you have to do it right. With the challenge identified as the lack of access to proper forensic tools and supplies and equipment, the sterile environment, and the transportation requirements in Peru, all of the supplies had to be brought in. In other words, believe it or not, even the scientific archaeologists that are in charge of the DNA do not have access to the supplies I did as a UFO investigator at a consumer level to go in and purchase everything we needed following the strictest guidelines. They just don't have it available. So we had to bring it in. I also knew right away that there was not a clean area that we could work, so this had to be established, and I outlined this and assembled all the tools we needed, all the sterilization products, all of this had to be brought in as well. But this unprecedented access to the pre-selected elongated skulls for DNA collection was indeed the first in a series of samples with professional controls in place. I have to repeat that, guys. This is the first time any professional scientific sampling has been done with professional controls in place. There could be no shortcuts. And of course, the last challenge absolutely is probably one of the biggest, but it remains that very little is documented about the post-mortem kinetics of DNA degradation and whether the rate of degradation varies between nuclear and mitochondrial DNA or across different skeletal tissues. A paleontolab or expert in ancient DNA would inform some of our sampling protocols, facilitating the development of improved samples so we could have maximum chances at successful results. In short, we still know very little about how and why DNA deteriorates and in what standard capacity or the conditions as two collected samples from the same evidence can produce two different stages of genetic decay. Unlike modern genetic analysis, ancient DNA studies have already been characterized by low-quality DNA. This places limits on what analysis can achieve. So, every step in extracting the sample was done with great discernment and a lot of patience. Personal security was a priority with all protocols and protections were used. Basically, we were excessive with it, guys. It was ridiculous because we had on every bit of this. We had on our clean suit. We had the boots. We had hair, the masks. And instead of the latex gloves, of course, we used sterile gloves. And that's another one of my little pet peeves out here in the field. Investigators, a lot of them probably haven't realized that latex gloves protect us from contamination. Sterile gloves protect our evidence. So you have to have sterile. Latex gloves aren't going to help keep contamination down. So we did have the sterile gloves. But this consisted of eye protection, hair cover, surgical masks, restricted access to the examination area, restrictive movement and workspace, professional industry tools, and collection procedures followed exact. The reason the environment had to be protected is that we had to keep the dust down, or we had to keep the controls on who was entering, who was exiting, and even the movement was very limited, again, not to create dust. Our samples were going to be osteology powder, so that would be a contaminant versus, you know, somebody's hair fall in. Well, they knew that wouldn't belong, if that makes sense. The examination setup, that first, a location was designated for the examination and the collection process. This room was secured with a barrier and a perimeter. Only the investigators could enter and exit and work. Once this area was closed, no one was allowed in the examination room with the exception of an investigator fully dressed in a clean suit and all other personal protection protocols in place. A sterile requirement was recognized. The workspace organization was also confined to a very limited area to avoid generating contaminants in the workspace from outside sources. Little movement was necessary, and this was our greatest chance of a clean sample. A new sterile mat was placed on the table for each skull examined, and there were no reused forensic tools ever. Each skull had a new individually wrapped and sterile set of supplies. This included our clean suits. For every skull, we completely took everything off, put them in a pile, and brand new gear was put on. Most of that was unnecessary. It didn't matter. We were willing to go a little further for this exam. First thing we did was document, and we started a chain of custody and also an inventory control sheet. And this started with everything from making sure we photographed the skull. This is number 3 that we had done. This is the number, and of course our exhibits. Individual skulls were photographed with identification number, evidence number control marker, and a photograph identifier card and a photo macrographic scale for size and identification. The skull would then experience a thorough inspection and observation that was documented as well as reviewed by the investigation team. The DNA extraction process consisted of scraping and filing the internal cranial bone for a predetermined number or volume of osteological particles or powder required for the DNA analysis. The samples were placed on a scale and measured, and this was for inventory control and to meet the required amount of the material requested from the lab for proper analysis. The osteology material was separated from the interior of the skull wall to a sanitized collection paper and then immediately placed into a collection container. Any remaining osteology product left on the mat was then swabbed with an air filter and air-breathable swab wrapped in Tyvek to avoid cross-contamination, and of course we used distilled water to collect those particles. The swab containment was chosen as it allows proper drying without adding bulky or hard-to-transport drying equipment. The swab that we used was the latest gold standard in protecting sample integrity. The sample would then be secured in an appropriate storage container with tamper-proof evidence tape applied, labeled, and a biological identification was then placed in separate evidence storage bag that also was tamper-proof. A chain of custody label and custody details were then documented. Tamper-proof evidence tape would be applied again for the security of any intrusion and proof that the samples were not manipulated, changed, or opened. The sample identification number and notes were placed on the inventory list for double security and documentation. Any hair or biological samples were secured in evidence paper envelopes, and the security processes and record-keeping experienced the same process. So we had the powder, but on the times where we were allowed to take a tooth and hair and maybe biological tissue still attached to the skull, those would all be placed in the proper paper, which was also the latest gold standard. But each skull examination would begin with that clean sweep. And this is really important that all materials previously used were completely discarded, new supplies restocked, and all new gear was put. The investigation identifiers, such as the cutout evidence number 10s and photographic log IDs, were changed to reflect a new skull and evidence, and the entire process started over. These steps were never compromised once, nor would a step in the process be eliminated. At this point, we're ready to leave. We have all our samples, they're packaged, they're documented, they're inventoried. We go back, we call it our champagne shot. We ordered a couple bottles of wine, which were almost overdue, if I have to say so. But we were so happy. But at this point, my stress started to begin. All I kept thinking about is, please pass border security, please get to the United States, please don't pull our permit, and please, what did I miss? What did I miss? Could I have done something better? Because what if these samples are contaminated and none of them could be used or none of them would be probative? The pressure I kind of felt, I felt like I would not only let LA down and the team and the financiers on this project, but I kind of would let everybody down in my field if I messed up so bad. So as much as I was happy the labor was over, my stress really started at that moment. The DNA collection did result, though, that we did have full confidence that the samples were not only viable for testing, but were prepared appropriately for all storage and transportation. The procedures required methods that were so exact, and the team knew we hit it. We nailed this one. We felt very confident. Again, I have to admit that I wasn't as cocky as everyone else, because this was my personal responsibility, the DNA. The additional satisfaction actually came when the information from the lab, well, let me save that for the next one. But basically, there was also something we realized. This just wasn't about finding a hybrid race, proof of giants, or maybe something very divergent from human. This also added information to a genetic library and the gene bank. This data can be studied today. Some of this information that we have now put in there hadn't been in there before. It could be studied in the future, could generate results just as DNA testing. Thank you so much, everybody. I almost canceled because I came back from Congress. I had influenza B, took me out for a couple weeks. I've been recovering, and my greatest fear was that I was going to get up here and this coughing thing that happens about every 90 minutes was going to happen. So right before I came up here, I did everything. I have like a little inhaler, all that, blah, blah, blah. But I apologize so sincerely. But it was, I wasn't, thank you. I was not contagious. And this, and I really, literally went to the doctor on Monday. But it's Ozark. And if I could make it and be with you all, if I had to crawl, I was going to be here. So thank you. Thank you. One of the, so we were pretty confident. And then after a few weeks, the DNA results came in. I was thrilled. First thing that we learned is that there was not one sample that they found contamination from the collection process. So I'm so happy. Thank you so much, you guys. And I understand some of these results are going to be hard to see on here, but I wanted you to have them. But for anyone that would like to come and look later, all of the results, including the breakdown of every haplogroup, everything that we have is very available, including the references from my PowerPoint. So as of 2018, we have produced more than 58 samples with over 35 revealing results. Some of the samples were indeed too degraded to give us any kind of results at all. And most of our results are coming from the mitochondrial side. Again, not understanding why some skulls would have more of this when they were actually older. Again, very is little known about the degradation of the DNA materials. We had 3 labs. Oh my gosh, you guys. We had 3 labs that all our samples were sent to. The Paleo lab in Canada were amazing. They're scientists. We do DNA. Here's the money. Do the DNA for us, please. They specialized in paleo DNA because this isn't just as easy as a 23andMe kit. So we found 3 labs that would do this for us. In the end, we were fuming because the only reason the labs were selected is because we could put them out publicly. Without the public and the scientific community having access to the name of the examiner, his credentials, his process through this, and the name of the lab, it's not evidence. It's like the prosecution using only their witnesses and telling you, well, just believe them. You know, you can't do that. And in the end, the results produced a firestorm that 2 of the labs said, absolutely not. We will be confidential and you cannot use our names. Of course, we were ready to, we're called lawyers. Nothing we could do about it. So we at least had 1, which is amazing. This is what the DNA results came out as. The Paracas baby came out as U2E1, and I'll explain all these. Not gonna bore everybody with these groups, but on the surface, they kind of look like they're all over the place. You have UBE, U2E. Basically, they're okay. H, K. We had T's, J's, H's, all over the place. But the preliminary trend in the DNA haplogroups does basically support the initial findings that we talked about on the video. So these are the haplogroups on our 58 samples. And of course, B is very common. It's from Central and Southeast Asia. We have D1 through D4H3A, mostly from Northeast Asia and Siberia. I just put the biggest denominator and origin, region of origin, and there are a couple others in here, and that's all in detail in the book. H is, of course, European, near Middle East. J is Near East, Pakistan and India. K is a descendant of haplogroup R, and it's mostly around Russia and Black Sea, and so on and so on. I love T, and that's Mesopotamia, and northern Syria and Turkey. And of course, X is descendants of Israel, North, Israel and Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. The preliminary trend in DNA haplogroups does support the majority of mitochondrial DNA results as non-indigenous people of Peru. The additional DNA results do not support the Beringian only model of prehistoric migration. You know, the land bridge that is kind of our accepted paradigm today. These results do not support only that model. We believe that our pilot results provide sufficient sampling to demonstrate that a transatlantic migration is plausible for some in the Paracas culture. 11 of the 15 samples originated from transatlantic areas that exposes somehow these people arrived in South America 500 years or more pre-Columbian. This was a bombshell. We knew it was a bombshell. We completely understood the pushback we immediately got from an archaeological professionals, anthropology professionals, all of them. It was just a bomb. But fortunately for us, science doesn't care what we believe, and this is what we present. It's just a start. We know it is. It's just the beginning of a new study. This is just new evidence, and we are not claiming or including certain and resolved answers. We're still on the trail, but we're raising the bar, and we need to finish this. We need to dig. On our last trip, we're in the Chongos necropolis, and while we were picking up, and examining some of the bones, as you saw in the pictures, human remains are littered everywhere. You're stepping over them almost every step. And we understand that with this many skulls, there's a step pyramid as well in this area. But we started noticing like this ridge. We're looking across on the desert landscape, and there's a ridge. And we kind of thought, well, what's that ridge doing there? We didn't notice that last time. And of course, the winds are always changing different directions and perspectives. So we walked over to the ridge and we started brushing off and cleaning it off. And we realized there's a wall. There's a rock wall. And of course, the next thing we want to say is, well, how deep does this go? So we dug just a little bit, guys, because we did not have a permit to dig in Chongos. We could take anything from the surface we needed, but we could not dig. And we were dying because we believe that we found it. So we go running up to the step pyramid. We run up to the step pyramid, we throw a drone up, we start, taking photographs and video of this area. We come back, we Google Earth it, we get some satellite footage, and oh my gosh, we're finding these structures. So right now we have permits going into Peru to dig and finish and do a full excavation, which of course is not easy, but basically we just started. We have just started. I independently continue my DNA collection, testing, documentation, and inquiry, because I am very, very interested in the hybrid race that I believe is more than probable and obviously here on Earth. From the ancient ancestors to sincerely the ones that are among us today. And in closing, I would like to state that the scientific results will determine the conclusions. I'm not going to convince anyone. I'm not trying to convince anyone. Our team is not saying anything. We are not putting out proclamations. Science doesn't care what we believe. This is a scientific inquiry, plain and simple. These are scientific facts, plain and simple. I am, and was, but I continue to be on the team, but deeply, deeply honored to work with L.A. Marzulli, Mondo Gonzalez, and Richard Shaw on this team. The integrity of making sure that we do everything right, the professional behavior, the standards of, it makes a difference what's on the inside. Anyone can, put on gloves and collect evidence, but that integrity and that truth seeker that is so important and is necessary. I have an open mind that I balance with, I guess it's you've got to balance with that, I've lost the word. But anyway, deeply honored to work with people that had the highest standards when it came to investigations, and we have to up the bar. And the reason we try so hard to do things right out here and to advance this field and to set the standards higher and to not accept the silliness or to not accept the results that aren't probative or doesn't pass scrutiny. And the reason we do this is one reason and one only: the witnesses, the people who experience things that are not supposed to exist, the people that have seen things, have had contact, who are experiencers. They have nowhere else to call. Can't call 911. They don't have a whole resource. We're all they have. And if we don't accept that responsibility of our title of investigator and try to be as good as we can, take every certification we can to work with those that are out here with these, they could help us and teach us, then we fail them. And we fail our mankind's quest for knowledge and the truth. And I'm going to be out here. I know that some may think it's ridiculous to be so scientific and to be so discerning. I promise you, I no longer work with people that cannot professionally follow high standards. And there's a reason for that, because this isn't a game. This is reality. This is truth. We are capable of exposing that. Even as independent researchers and investigators, it lies in our hands, and we owe it to those who are counting on us. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the patience and the sincere forgiveness for my little interruption. But I thank you all so very, very much. Thank you. Oh, my God.